look back with me for just a moment. It's raining outside, it's summer vacation, and the only thing you have at this moment is a game to play. Final Fantasy, Mario, Zelda, Crash Bandicoot, whatever sets you back, I'm sure you have a feeling on it. Video games were easier to enjoy back then and just more immersive, right? I remember spending hours being invested in these. These feelings are important, and we hold on to them and cherish their personal meanings and qualities. We should all be familiar with what warm feeling you get inside when you experience one of those games, and we all get it because we all have those nostalgic feelings. And yes, we mostly all remember those games too, even if we experienced it differently. The people making games now share those experiences too, or at least they know how fondly you remember them. Nostalgia is a tool that can take you to a place that you feel familiar and comforted, but can also be used to take advantage of your heart, feelings, or enjoyment of an art. And that's what brings us here today to No Controller Necessary. My name is Duncan.
And I am Alex.
And today on No Controller Necessary, we're going to be tackling nostalgia as it relates to games. So we're going to be breaching a lot of different topics, things we're nostalgic for, the power of nostalgia in different sorts of games, as well as relating to the way different games or companies are using nostalgia today. So yeah, that's what we're going to be tackling today. I just want to go with a cold, hard question for you, Alex. And this is going to be swinging it right to you, buddy.
Okay, I'm ready.
Are you sure?
I got the bat. I got the bat held up. I'm ready to make this a home run. Baseball metaphors. Go on.
What is the last thing that triggered your nostalgia? The $1 million question.
Oh, man. The $1 million question is answered infinitely easier right now in April than it would have been in March, because the last thing that triggered my nostalgia was 100% the last game that we did an episode on, which was the Final Fantasy VII Remake. I don't want to dive too deeply into it, but boy, howdy, we played and talked about maybe the first 10 hours of that 30-hour game. I'm about 21 hours in, and you know I've been listening to the soundtrack from the original game on repeat for like 3, maybe 2 weeks since I've been working, just reliving every ounce of being 7 years old and playing through that game again.
So you're listening to the new soundtrack?
I listened to the new soundtrack a little bit, and then when I'm like, okay, I don't want to hear the new remixes of songs I haven't run into yet, I jump back to the 1997 soundtrack and listen to that one straight through, because it's still 100% like declassified bangers.
Do you prefer the soundtrack of songs that you have heard in the new game as opposed to the old songs? Or do you kind of like flip-flop back and forth? So like, let me just kind of like, everyone wants to hear that kind of thing. Like, do you like to hear that in the new version or the old version?
I will say I actually think the new version soundtrack is better. I think that they did an incredible job keeping the spirit of the old one and kind of adding finishing touches. But a lot of the songs that I'm actually the most nostalgic for aren't going to be in this new version because they're from later in the game. So I can't get that same sort of like feel-good B7 vibes unless I go back to the songs that aren't in this version of the game so far.
Do you think there's any sort of any composition of the new version of a soundtrack that would leave you feeling like this doesn't work for me? Or because it like inherently has the same notes and like flow as the old song, it just is going to work for you no matter what?
No, I 100% believe that there are versions of this updated soundtrack that would not work for me, right? I think if you just took the original 1997 like chiptune, maybe not chiptune, I don't know music terms well enough to talk about that, but if you took the original like 1997 PS1 era music and just said like, okay, we have the score, we are going to play orchestral arrangements of this exact score, I think that would be fine, but I think it would feel flat.
Cool.
But that's not what this did, right? And I think part of that is because the composer, I'm pretty sure Nobu Uematsu, as I believe how you pronounce his name, is still the same composer on both of them. I think it's just been like he's been working with other people on this. But what it really does, and this will probably be a lot of what we talk about in this episode, is it takes the heart of what those original tracks were, right? It gets like, here are the specific, notes that you remember. Here's like the specific runs that you remember. Here's the specific like key changes and shifts in tone that you remember. But we're going to give you enough of that so that it's the old song, but we're going to layer everything on top of it that we were incapable of doing in 1997 on the PS1 that like really drives home the effect of why you like the song, right? It really drives home the like, okay, here's like a bunch of layered, complex, different things like weaving with one another to like really keep you on the edge of your seat and keep you interested in a way that the original 97 soundtrack wasn't capable of doing, but that's how you felt in 97 because that's what it was capable of doing, right?
Right.
So I think that is like the fact that they didn't just take it and then remaster it, they took it and turned it into what it would have been if it was released in 2020.
There's a huge difference between re-enhancement and reenactment. You know what I mean? Like where as the soundtrack could have been reenacted, just like you said, like we're going to take the exact same notes, the exact same, the exact same formatting and recreate it versus enhancing it a little bit more. Ah, cool.
Yeah, and I want to real quick, I do just want to say, just to give some context to what we're talking about, because we can do this for audio with nothing else, I would like to play just like a 10 seconds of a clip from the original 97 right here and 10 seconds from the 2020, just so you can get the idea of what they're doing. No. I want to make sure we got that in there because I think that this whole conversation loses it without that context.
No, I won't.
Well, look.
Alex, we
I
talked
tried.
about this. I can put in one song a podcast. When I edit, it's hard to do. Okay? It's hard to put in more
you
than one
didn't
song.
hear it, blame it on Duncan. He's the one that hates our fans, okay? Not me. I love you all. What was the last thing you were nostalgic for? What's the last thing, not that you were nostalgic for, what's the last thing that really triggered that nostalgic feeling that brought you back?
Let me take you back. No, I'm just kidding. I just do the intro again. I legitimately busted out my Nintendo 64 and forced my significant other to play Mario Party with me. If you caught up on our 100th episode, a long time tradition for the Duncan. Forcing
you heard
people.
it here first, folks. Duncan hates his significant other and wants her to have a bad time.
No, she's actually extremely interested in playing Mario Party, and I busted out Mario Party, and like I've kind of like I feel like Mario Party is so like up to date and current that it's not really like triggering my nostalgia in the same way. But what did is when I was perusing, getting my dirty little fingers in my whole N64 collection and pulled out that DK64 cartridge, and that's what did it for me, man.
Rolling back to those DK64 days.
Rolling back to renting DK64, getting to the third level and having to return it. Like, man, and what a powerful feeling to just say, like, no, Mom, I'm going to keep this game because I'm 26 and I can play it now. All together, I can play the whole thing. And I got to the fourth or fifth level, and interestingly enough, I'm just like, well, I'm not that interested in it anymore. I got all of the bananas from the levels that I used to play when I was younger, and then when I got to the less familiar levels, I'm like, this is just isn't fun for me anymore. And I think that is a huge like testament to me to say, like, the reason I enjoy DK64 is pure nostalgia and nothing else. There is, and it's very dissimilar to the Final Fantasy VII remake, where it's like, you know, this is an enhanced version of something that you feel nostalgic for. I'm playing an old game that I felt nostalgic for, and it is just not a great video game toe to tip. And when it really comes down to it, and I'm like, okay, I still like the controls feel the same, but just the level and the music, and I'm like huge into the like music of feeling game music and stuff like that. And when I heard the music, I'm like, I don't recognize this track, and it just didn't feel right.
So I'm curious in that particular instance then, right? Like you made it through the first 3 levels on pure nostalgia. Was there a point when you were going through those first 3 levels where you were like, hey, this is cool that it's a throwback, but I recognize this actually is a bad video game? Or was it not until after you got back? Okay.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so there were so many instances where you just walk down a hallway. So if you're not really familiar with the mechanics of DK64, there's 5 Kongs, right? And you got to switch between the Kongs at tag barrels to collect certain collectibles. It's a famous game for having way too many collectibles, yada, yada, yada. But it leads you on trails with certain Kongs with collectibles. So there could be a line of bananas down a hallway, and let's say they're Diddy's bananas. So you run down that hallway, and at the end of the hallway, there's nothing for Diddy. It's just a hallway of bananas they knew they had to put somewhere. So it's like, as a kid, that didn't matter to me because I got the satisfaction of collecting those bananas, and I knew that it would bring me towards the next boss. That kind of mindset. But now it's like, you're wasting my time. Back then, I didn't feel those feelings of like, God, this game's wasting my fucking time, and it's got bad level design. It was just beautiful Kongs, beautiful 3D monkeys.
Love those big giant 3D monkeys.
Right.
Do you remember what the public reaction was to that game at the time? I'm very curious about Donkey Kong 64 in particular because, I have no nostalgia for it whatsoever. I didn't own an N64. I never played a Donkey Kong game, full stop. Even today, I don't think I've played a strictly Donkey Kong game.
You are asking the right person because I have gone into a deep dive to just learn about DK64. By the way, if any of you are interested in DK64 content, check out the tool-assisted speedrun explanation video. It is fascinating. Anyways, so the public reaction to it was actually pretty positive.
Really? Okay.
To certain, it was positive mixed because I think they just did a lot of things. I think it was back in the time where game length and how long could you keep your shitty fucking kid sitting down and just entertained with something. And I think that DK64 did an amazing job because of how long and how much there was to do in it. And people just valued that more, right? People were like, it's got 100 levels. That's always in those old commercials.
People still value that shit a lot. It's just that now it's built into most games that it's you just play the bad competitive version of it for 600 hours and be really good at this game that nobody likes.
Right.
And we don't need to advertise how many levels we have. Haha, we're Fortnite. And so that's and that's just what people do now instead. So
right. And the thing that's cool is it had such a positive reception, but as time went on, the negative reception just built on and on and on and on because people later down the line blamed it as the death of 3D collectathon platformers because while it financially did okay, it was a complete flop because it required that big red ugly expansion pack that you stuck into your N64 because otherwise it had some sort of bug, which I've heard that it may or may not actually be true and that it may have been planned from the start. I don't know. It's a whole thing. I'm not going to get into it. But those kind of that content and that kind of videos of being like I said, the tool assisted speedrun and stuff like that is a whole other subgenre of nostalgia that I really, really love where it's take me back to the people who made the things that I loved in a time that I didn't understand.
Yeah. I mean, that is really interesting. That is endlessly fascinating to me, especially because so many of these games that you and I in particular are nostalgic for, we were a little bit too young to, really have, a understanding at large of, what was going on with it, right? I can't count the number of games I rented from my local video store with just, this because it looks cool on the back of the box, right? I had no fucking clue whether or not people thought it was a good video game. So going back and being hey, this is how this game that you were super nostalgic for was received and also how it changed the landscape of the games, for good or bad. and then comparing it to like other games that came out at the same time, like Mario 64, like it's fascinating to see how nostalgia completely colors our perception of those games, just because of the age that we were at the time that they came out.
Yeah, and you and I are in particularly very different boats where, you're a avid, I didn't own an N64. This just is a foreign concept to me. And every time I'm sure you have more than just me going, "You didn't play Mario 64?" And like I'm really interested for you, and I know like you have played N64 games in the future, but I'm just I'd love to like hear your takes on going back to those hits and in a vacuum, like playing those and understanding and seeing if they really hit well with you.
Yeah, I mean, and to some extent, I did that, right? Like, to some extent, I in my freshman year of college, so it would have been like 2011, 2010, 2011, like, I went back, and that was the first time I played Ocarina of Time, because I had access to an N64, and I was like, hey, let's do that, and, like, you can definitely tell, like, there are certain games that just hold up despite nostalgia, right? There are certain games that, like Ocarina of Time, that kind of like, hey, the design on this was good, that's why it was elevated to a certain level. But then I didn't play things like Donkey Kong 64, and there were definitely other, like, I played like Star Fox 64. Not great. Star Fox 64 is not a great video game.
Yeah.
So, like, I think it's really interesting to look at those. I think it's very interesting when you have two people, one person who has nostalgia for them and one person who doesn't have nostalgia for them. As long as you are both cool and won't get super contentious when one person's like, why did you like this shitty fucking game? But I think that's really interesting kind of interaction to see the differences in how people view those sort of things.
So I don't get too, like, so I don't have to, like, wrap back around to this. Do you think we could talk about, I kind of want to speak about 3D platformers, collectathons specifically, for a little bit, because I think it's really important when talking about nostalgia, because the 100% best nostalgia bait, in my opinion, is ukulele. I think it is just like, it's a total cash cow for it. Like, it just, okay, I don't want to say nostalgia bait is like a negative thing. It just like, the whole point is...
because definitely ending something with the word bait typically means it's not negative, for sure.
But, okay, so here's the thing. You got to look at A Hat in Time versus Ukulele, right? Are you familiar with
and
those
these
titles?
So, they were both, as far as I can understand, chasing the Banjo-Kazooie high pretty hard.
Or Sunshine. Mario Sunshine was more
we should
what
clarify,
A Hat in Time was chasing.
Obviously, just so everyone is aware, but like when we talk about nostalgia, we're trying to talk about it like writ large, but... we're both in our mid-20s, so we're going to be nostalgic for, like, late 90s, early 2000s games. Like, that's the genre we're going to be, like, largely touching on. I understand that if you're, 5 years younger or 10 years older, like, your nostalgia is going to be a little bit different from ours, but that's just where we're able to pull from right now.
Sure. And I think the difference between those two is the same thing we talked about when we were talking about the Final Fantasy VII music, right? It's enhancement versus recreation. The, ukulele was just a recreation of a lot of the same mechanics that Banjo-Kazooie had, and those mechanics just might not hold up in that certain world or that certain environment or, the current systems and things like that. Or if you try and upgrade it in the wrong way, like they tried to upgrade it in a way where like, we'll just make it bigger and more pretty. That just doesn't, it just doesn't work, and it didn't work. And a lot of people came to that game with a lot of negative reception, and I think it's really important to know when to use it as a tool to draw people in versus when to use it as a tool to base your whole video game around, because that's what ukulele is. They base their whole game around it, and like it's so apparent in the mechanics where it's like they have the same abilities, where it's like, oh my god, do they have to have the same, like, exact same abilities? Do they have to be a combo of two animals? Do you have to collect jiggies or pages or notes or feathers, to progress? And I think it's completely unnecessary, where A Hat in Time looks at it and says, let's exactly extract what people loved about those games, but make it our own, make it new and fresh. And I think that's so important with so many games, to make it fresh. And I think a
Which
lot
is
of
interesting,
Yeah.
because I feel like a lot of people, when they initially envision that, that's not what they want, right? Like, I feel like I say this all the time on, Twitter threads or forum posts or whatever, when people are talking about games. They're like, I really want a remake of that. And then when people ask how it's done, a lot of the times the prevailing theory is like, oh, I just want the exact same game, but I want it to look really nice instead.
Yeah.
Or I want like the exact same game, but I want it to run better. But I feel like in practice, nobody actually wants that, right? Like, and that's part of the thing. Like, maybe you release and you'll get high def versions of games to come out from the past, which is obviously different from completely remaking it from the ground up. But if you just get like a high res version of a game, like people will be like, oh cool, it's a new way to play the game, it looks a little bit better. But like, that's it, right?
They do want it, because look at the WoW Classic remake, man. The famous line from one of the someone from the dev team of WoW. Someone said, do you think about bringing classic WoW servers back? And the guy classically said, you think you want that, but you don't. And I love that line. And I agree with it a lot, where I'm like, you guys think you want this experience, because I mostly agree with you, where it's like, I just don't want an HD version of it. Bring me something new. But there are a lot of people who just want you to make that exactly as it was, just a little bit more enhanced, and roll it right back out.
So I think with WoW Classic, there's a couple of things going on. I think the two major points that immediately draw me to like, why did people enjoy that? Because people did really like it, right? I think one of the things is WoW still exists. Like, it kept going, and it kept adding on layers of complexity, and it kept like reducing barriers for entry to new people, and like barriers for how quickly they could get up to the level cap and things like that. And I think that plays a huge hand in it, because when you are still actively engaged with a game like that, or when you're still actively engaged with a piece of media like that, it's a lot easier to be like, okay, I still have this, but I kind of want to remember more what it was like when I initially started playing it, and to like do a little compare and contrast of the differences, or specifically, I didn't like the direction it took. So I think that's kind of one of the things there, is the fact that it was still going. The other thing is, I don't really think MMO design has changed much since WoW first came out. WoW was kind of like, here's the big MMO that's going to take over the world after EverQuest. And then kind of like, I've played MMOs recently, and they're not really very different from that. So I think it's a little different between that versus like, something like a 3D, collectathon or 3D platformer, where it's like the way that we fundamentally think about how movement should feel in games, and the way that we fundamentally think about how progression exists in games, specifically with like RPG elements being added to virtually every game, and specifically with like, things like Ukulele came out on the N64, and that controller was universally dog shit. Like, you can't recreate that exact feeling, because we know what it feels like to have something better than that. And like MMOs, and I'm sure I'm making a lot of people who have played MMOs very angry right now, but like, there have been changes, but they felt much more incremental, right? There hasn't been anything that felt like a fundamental shift in the way you have to play MMOs since WoW came out.
Yeah, I'll agree with you on a very fundamental level. I think it was just harder, and things were more like, when I ask people like, why did you like WoW Classic? Most of the time, or why are you playing it now? Most of the time what they tell me is it's harder, and the human interaction is different. I'm communicating more with people. And I think that's what's fascinating, is like, WoW took the communication out of the game, and I think a lot of people value that, which is, I don't know. I think that's a whole other can of worms that I don't really want to get into.
What do you mean it took the communication out of the game? Full disclosure, I played a little bit of WoW when it initially came out, and then bounced pretty early on and didn't play Classic.
So are you aware of like how Dungeon Finder works, basically?
Generally, yeah.
Okay, so you queue up as a role, and then it matches you with 5 other people to run a dungeon, right? So that was not in WoW Classic. Like that whole thing was not there. You used to have to like, be in a guild, or like stand in front of the actual dungeon, and look for other people to, work this out with, and sort of sell yourself. And the raid, like, there's also Raid Finder now, where it's like you can just queue up and raid with people in an easier way.
Yeah, absolutely.
where people miss the sort of like group of community, and like there was no such thing as non-PvP. So it's like, I can get ganked and messed up and, fucked over. And I think that is a perfect example of like, these people really liked this thing that used to be, but any newcomer to it is going to hate it, because I was a newcomer to the old WoW system and it just didn't feel right for me. And I don't know. It's I think there's definitely two or three paths of nostalgia, and I think one of the easiest ones to sort of like recreate, and most of the time it's weakest for outsiders, is let me just make it again.
Yeah, and I think that's true, right? I think when you go for that remake style where you're like, I'm just going to from the ground up recreate exactly how this was, but I will change the graphics so they're a little bit nicer. I will like add a few quality of life changes to the control scheme. You're going to please a subset of people. You're not going to draw in new fans, really. And I think that, like I said, typically I think people will run away from it quicker than they would otherwise. But I do think WoW Classic it's a fair example in terms of like, here is something to the contrary, right? But, then there's a lot of high-profile remakes going on right now. Again, like Final Fantasy VII Remake just dropped. Resident Evil 2 just recently dropped. Resident Evil 3 and 4, or Resident Evil 3 is out now. Resident Evil 4 has been announced. Like, there's a lot of stuff that's popping off right now, and it seems like the things that are being successful are where they take the core idea, run with it, but bring it into, like 2020 in terms of, hey, here's how this should play, and kind of expanding on core feelings as opposed to expanding on core ideas, right?
Mechanics and things like that.
Yeah.
Because I think the important thing to note with like the FF7 remake or like Resident Evil 2 is like, you take the feelings and the music and that's all you grab. Like that's all you take with you. And I think that's really smart.
Yeah. Pay homage to the story, keep the same characters and everything like that, but even that needs to be updated because games writing has come a long way in 2020 from where it was in 97 or 94 or whatever.
C. Barrett.
Well, I mean, mostly C. Barrett.
As in, let's take a look.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think there's, there are really interesting things to be taken when you do a remake like that, and remakes are going to be a huge focal point for this entire episode, just because that that's playing into nostalgia. But I think it's really interesting, again, bringing up something like Yooka-Laylee, because you look at like you said, Yooka-Laylee versus Hat in Time, or look at Yooka-Laylee versus like FF7, which is literally just the same game, and it's not even a full portion of the game, but like it feels extremely different because one of them like. And again, I didn't play Yooka-Laylee, so I'm kind of banking on you to be able to give me this.
Sure.
But it felt like Yooka-Laylee was like, hey, here's what people want, and it felt like it was maybe developed by people who really had a lot of affinity for Banjo-Kazooie, but didn't really know what they wanted to do with it. They just knew that like that was hot and they liked that game, and then they wanted to redo it. And I feel like a lot of successful remakes, like again, like Final Fantasy VII, are very much like, hey, this is a passion project. I know why. Like, I don't know that, like, that people love this game. I know why people loved this game, and I know how that translates nowadays, and we can make those updates. And I think being able to separate that, like, what from that why is, like, crucial to understanding what about nostalgia is so powerful and what about nostalgia can be effectively used as opposed to kind of, like, seedy is the wrong word, but it's kind of what I want to go like effectively used versus kind of like not even necessarily ineffective, but like immorally used. There's a word I can't figure it out, but you know what I mean. Hopefully,
so yeah, I do know what you mean. So I think so. Here's something interesting. To the first thing you said is like, were these a group of people who have like had a large affinity for the game, etc. There were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people on that team who founded the company who were all previously working for Rare or were the founders of Rare.
Really?
Yeah. And the person who composed the music was Grant Kirkhope, or composed most of the music, possibly, that did a lot of for Banjo-Kazooie. And by the way, the music there is good.
Yeah, I would imagine. Grant Kirkhope does great stuff. Were the people who were working for Rare, do you know, were they working there at the time the Banjo-Kazooie or Banjo-Tooie were made?
According to the wiki, I'm seeing previously work at Rare. I'm not sure. That I have to look a little bit more into, but I assume if they worked, I mean, if I remember watching a couple of the documentary videos, they were on that team.
Okay.
So I think
that's really interesting.
Yeah, I think that I never thought that ukulele was malicious. I think that
no,
in any way, I think it was more like, let's make something that the people want. And they thought that this is what they want. And I think that this is a perfect case of you think you want it, but you don't, in a way where it's like they showed what they had and people were like, yes, this is what we want. Yes. And then they got it. And they're like, this isn't what we wanted. But Platonic was like, this is what we showed you, though. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
And I remember when it was in its development, I was really invested in like watching every video that was out there for it, seeing all the screenshots. I'm like, this doesn't feel right. But when I scrolled down and I looked at the comments, everyone was jazzing about it, and they're like, it's just it's not finished yet or something like that. But I don't think so.
It's also it's interesting and to some degree difficult to talk about these things because there is another element, right? It's not just, are you strictly playing to nostalgia and are you updating it? There's also an element of like, okay, like, is the design of the game good, right? Like, is the level design good? Is the writing snappy? Does it feel good to play? And those don't necessarily tie into nostalgia. Oftentimes they do, right? You can see level design from 2000 and know that it's level design from 2000.
Right.
You can see writing from 1995 and know that it's writing from 1995, guys. So there's another layer there to kind of keep in mind when we're talking about all this, but it's hard to talk about that for every single game that we're going to talk about and every single feeling that we're going to talk about.
Sure. I think I want to change gears a little bit because we've been talking about like, this sort of like recreating versus updating or making changes to for quite a while here.
We don't have good words for this shit.
Yeah, I was trying to say like remaster or recreation, but I kind of lost the thread there.
It's all the same thing. Remaster, recreate, update, remake. It's all the same. It's hard. Words are bad.
So when you consume a piece of content, whether it's a game or even we can even expand this to shows or music even, that you recognize has nostalgia in it, like it's trying to play to your nostalgia. For me personally, I say fuck me up with that. Just inject it right into my veins. I'm cool with it. Just do it. Like, just do it. If you're going to do it, if you do it right, just do it to me. How do you feel about that? Like, are you, when you recognize that someone is just like, this is an 80s show or something like that, does that bother you or are you okay with it?
It depends on the show, right? If it's just, hey, look what it was like in the 80s, right? If season 1 of Stranger Things was just, hey, we took this aesthetic, isn't it cool how well we mirrored this aesthetic? It would be interesting, but it wouldn't be good in my mind.
Sure.
I think it's really, like, if you play for that nostalgia, it has to be on top of something that already has some degree of substance to it. So if it's like
as a setting.
Yeah, like if you're playing music and you want it to sound like it's, from the late 60s or something like that, that's fine, but you still have to be like composing good original works that like have some kind of like new energy to it. It can't just be these are the, chords and riffs that were popular in the 60s and we just strung a bunch of them together, right? So I think it can add something on top of it, but I don't think that by itself is enough of a basis for me to be interested in any piece of media.
Here's a light theory I have. I think that there are a lot of games or shows that have an idea, but there may be something where it's like, hey, let's tack an 80s theme onto this to help you sell it. Let's tack something that's nostalgic to it to help gain interest. And then when people realize that there's more under the hood, they'll stick around. I think that is something that happens, or at least I feel like it does, because this farther, and I'm going to use Stranger Things as an example here, the farther you get into Stranger Things, like there's an honest like curve downwards where it's like it becomes less and less and less about being in the 80s every episode. But if you look at the trailer or the first episode, like, those are huge factors.
Oh, yeah.
So,
I would be very surprised if that does not happen, right? I mean, and there are entire shows built around that, a la That 70s Show, which came out in, like, the 90s or whatever, and was literally like, do you guys remember the 70s? Isn't that wild? I like That 70s Show. I think it's pretty funny. I think it appealed to an audience that didn't remember the 70s as well. Yeah. But, like, that is definitely, that moves sales, right? Like, having that aesthetic, having that callback definitely will get your numbers up. So I imagine that they probably drape that on top of things that didn't otherwise need that heavy nostalgia.
Yeah, I guess that's my more better definition of nostalgia bait, where it's like, hey, there's this thing that you remember and you feel comfortable or like happy about or comfort or just something like that by or interested in, and we're gonna veil it under an interesting story we want to tell. I don't know. I think that's an interesting way to play something up, and pretty much, in a weird way, any game that has pixel graphics or things like that are sort of inadvertently doing that, whether it's their intention or not. It's sort of, you're looking at it and you're like, oh man, it's like this or something like that at certain points. So I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that
it's not that it's a bad thing either.
No, and I want to be very clear that we're not like condemning anything that does this, because I think it can be used very effectively, and like anything that can work to elicit an emotional response that like has value is still not necessarily bad because it leans into that one way or the other. But I think it gets hard to talk about this specifically in games, right? Because we look at things like, indie games that are coming out that are like heavily pixelated or using a lot of pixel art. And you can easily look at that and say, well, it's just trying to call back to like, it's trying to call back to people who played a lot of games in like the very early 90s or whatever. And it's just playing to that nostalgia. But a lot of that is because like those people who are making games now are nostalgic for that time period, so they like want to kind of pay homage to the games that they grew up on. And B, the people making those games now are like incredibly small teams, and art in games is really hard to do and really hard to make good. And when you do things like pixel art, you're able to still make art that looks good, but like it is much quicker to make that type of art than it is to make like, fully rendered 3D environments that look perfect that you can move around, right? Like it's to some extent, it is where do you put the limited amount of resources you have? But obviously, there are games that very intentionally want that art style for a specific reason. So there's a weird interaction there when you get down to small creative teams versus what is like popular media doing at this time in this era.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with that.
So with all of that being said, I just kind of want to swing back here, and I want to talk to you, and I want to get your opinion a little bit on where this nostalgia kind of breaks down. Like, where does it cease to be healthy nostalgia, where you're like, hey, this is something cool, this is something I liked when I was younger, versus where does it become a glorification of the past, right? Where does it become a failure to acknowledge what was wrong with those issues that you had earlier? Like, have you run into that in games specifically? Or do you know any issues with that?
Not in games specifically, but I think glorification of the past is an amazing term, and like, especially when it comes to nostalgia and eras. Like when we were talking about, maybe that 70s show or things like even before that were like, there were still a lot of things that were not great about the world and country. There's
a lot of people that think we should go back to the 50s, and that's not good.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, there are certain people who are like, God, I wish I lived in the 50s. And I'm like, no, you don't. Like, what are you talking about? No, you don't. And I think...
If you're anything other than a straight white male, you would have had a horrible time in the 50s.
Sort of like an example of glorification of the past as far as eras go. But as far as games go, I think there is a lot of mechanical things that I think we hold on to. And I think there's a huge difference between when it works, and Well, it was in the last one, and we talked a lot about that when remaking things. And my specific, like, sort of like snipe is at all the weird Dota mechanics, like these weird, like, pulling jungle creeps into the lane because that was something that happened in Warcraft. And it's like, but that's what it was before. And I don't think that's healthy at all. That doesn't, it just, that kind of stuff really is an unhealthy way for old like mechanics. And I think that's not necessarily an example of nostalgia, but I think you can translate that to nostalgia, specifically save points. I think there are a lot of games that still use save points where like we live in a world where most consoles have like a bajillion gigabytes on it and it's fine. You can just fucking save file over it at any time you want. And like save states are pretty easy to just track the character's location and inventory. And, you know, there are some mechanical reasons to justify not like saving at any point. Lives are another thing, like, you know, lives being a thing for arcades a lot of the times where it's like you get 3 tries per coin, but you own the console. So why should you? It doesn't make any sense. So,
and with that one particularly, there are like, you know, there is some degree of, hey, you know, we're trying to make this more difficult, like we're trying to give it like a reward for completing it in like a set time frame. But I think like the natural progression of the life system, like, hey, you have X number of lives, is I think honestly just roguelikes. Roguelikes in the format that they exist now, as opposed to like, you know, Rogue when it initially came out, which is still very complicated and like a very specific thing. But the idea of like, hey, you have one life to make it from point A to the end of the game is really just the life system extended in a way that like it's built more naturally into the design of the game and not intended to rake quarters out of 13-year-olds, right? Like it's you know,
and I think
it's more interesting that way.
And you could even like when we're talking about sort of like naturally translating lives, and this is like Dark Souls, you only really have one life, but you have Estus flasks that are just health potions for those of you who haven't played the game, and that sort of serves as your lives, saying like, okay, you only have 3, or, you know, as you go along the game you get more, but like you only have 3 of these to regain your life until you get to the next place. It's sort of like your lives, except you have to use them before. So I think that's a really nice way to naturally translate those sort of lives mechanics to get to the other side. When you're talking about, sorry, go ahead.
No, you're. I was just gonna lean onto there and talk about like, you know, I think that is really interesting, and I think that is an example of good progression of a system where it takes something that was necessarily intended for another purpose and captures the feeling of what it ended up evoking, and like, you know, moves it into the modern era. And I think that's really good. And I don't mean to step on your point entirely here, but before I forget, I want to mention that like I think the opposite of this is really the idea of people like glorifying difficulty of games in the past and like length of games in the past, specifically in like, you know, the NES and like pre-era where it's like, oh, this game was really hard, right? Like this game was super hard, and like games nowadays are like really easy. And, you know, to some degree this is an issue with games culture instead of just glorification of the past. But I think that there is a degree of people being like, oh, like games in my day were like way harder and you didn't have like this quality of life and this quality of life and this quality of life thing, and like they've really dumbed it down for a modern audience. And I just like, this is not specific to games, right? People feel the same way about music, people feel the same way about like TV, people feel the same way about movies and stuff like that. But like it bothers me to no end when people try to tout out that argument of like, oh, well, like back in my day of games, you know, you didn't have XYZ to make it easy. And it's like, yeah, but like games aren't just meant for 13-year-olds on summer break anymore. Like, I've got a full-time job and stressors that I want to worry about. So like, I don't necessarily want the most difficult experience. I want these quality of life improvements so that if I'm 25 minutes into a game and then have to get up to do something else with my life that is more important, I can do that without losing that progress necessarily, right? And I think that is like one of the keynote things that I have seen when people glorify the past is they like glorify the failure of mechanics to account for everyday life in them and the way that that has been changed nowadays. And I think that is like, again, like I said, it happens with a lot of different types of media, but every time it happens, it bothers me to no end, and it reeks of somebody not like digging down a little bit deeper and understanding why these changes are made, I feel like.
Yeah, that's It's a really good point, and specifically like the back in the day thing is definitely one of my kind of like biggest pet peeves. I'm sure it is a lot of people, or like, you know, when I played games X, Y, or Z. And I do think though sometimes there is a sort of like wholesome nature to the simplicity of the way things were. And I think that can play, you know, with design really well. I think one of the most interesting sort of design philosophies I've run into as I've been like researching how to design things a little bit easier, because I've been struggling with it myself, is give yourself as many limitations as possible, and then you will understand how to make things and how to make things good at their core. Because I think right now, with all of the different systems we have to make things, and, you know, all these tools that creators have, you have a really hard time with overflow and just being like, I wish I could just go back, and not go back, but like have a limited view of things. And I think that's a healthy way to look at, you know, being nostalgic for something, in the sense of like, there was a simpler time where you only had 8 colors to play with. And I think that was on the back of a lot of good design, because like you were so limited. And that doesn't really speak to like then versus now, but it speaks to then, and that being a really important time. And when we understood it just works. And I think that I want to kind of transition that into talking about healthy nostalgia, of being like, this thing worked and we want to sing it throughout the ages. Like, I think in a weird way, like in my mind, Final Fantasy VII, like, you know, with the remake and everything kind of coming out, is like, the story beats probably just worked. Like, there were just things that just seemed to work for the game, and it made it a success because there were elements of it that made people happy. I think Mario 64 is the same thing, where it's like Mario Odyssey, the controller is the exact same, except the hat and everything like that, but the base controller just worked. There's no need to touch it. So I think there's a hugely important distinction between what just works and what you're just holding on to because you used to love it.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. I think those are two really good examples, so I'm struggling to think of any more just like right off the top of my head. But I think you're right that there are versions of nostalgia where I shouldn't even say versions of nostalgia, right? Because I don't think it's necessarily that, right? Like, there is
layers.
People can be nostalgic for specific things because they were really good, and I think that almost is separate from the type of nostalgia that you hold just for things because you were a specific age.
How do you identify that? I mean, how do you identify? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I mean, that's really hard, right? Like, that is kind of the core question, is like, how do you separate your emotional reaction because of a nostalgic feeling you have for something versus the like intrinsic quality of it? And I think that is like, I do think that's a problem that people struggle with every single time they are engaged in nostalgia, right? And like, there's, you know, there are reasons for it, right? Like being nostalgic for something like is a chemical reaction. Like it releases serotonin or dopamine or whatever, and like makes you feel good. Like there are parts of your brain that are specifically stimulated when you engage in this nostalgic feeling, which also means there are parts of your brain that can be tricked or become addicted to this nostalgic feeling, right? Like, I think that there are like very real difficulties of trying to overcome that, and I think it requires a level of like, you know, emotional intelligence and honesty that is like frequently hard to like pull in to yourself and hard to grapple with sometimes. So I don't know, like, I don't have a good way to do this. I don't have a like system in place. I'm saying like all the time now, and I'm just realizing it, and I hate it. I don't have a system in place to separate how I feel about a game from the time period in which I originally engaged with it. Same thing with, you know, music and movies and everything like that. You know, I can't listen to, you know, Bare Naked Ladies 1998 Stunt without being immediately pulled back to that time in my life. But
Third Eye Blind,
I can recognize I can recognize that it's a good game or an amazing piece of music if I just like actually sit down and like try to take it apart, but I don't know how I do. Like, do you know how you do that? Like, have you noticed that like specifically happening at any point in your life?
Yeah, I mean, it depends a lot on whether you want it to be ruined or not. So, like, I think that showing others who haven't experienced it and having them consume it is a great way to, like, address the quality of something and know that if you just like it, depending on nostalgia, and also just, like, the internet. You know what I mean? Like, but again, that is a possible echo chamber, like, you know, I'm going to communities that are talking about this game and they all like it, so it must be good, which is wrong. So, you know, you kind of have to, like, be careful with that. But, you know, specifically with other people, and I'll go right back to DK64 because I thought, like, you know, the first 3 levels I played were awesome. And I played them in bed mostly, which is, you know, right next to my significant other. She watched it and was like, this looks terrible. These colors are so ugly. Why do you like this? I'm like, I don't know, but I do. And that's exactly what it is. It's like, you have to, you know, and, you know, she just may have not enjoyed that sort of game, but even so, like, that's a great way to measure the quality of something versus your nostalgic feelings for it. But also, like you said, taking a critical look at it and really, you know, thinking like, okay, if I were to play this, no past feelings whatsoever, would I have liked it? And that's a hard thing to do. It's not easy.
Yeah.
But sometimes you have to just say, fuck it. It doesn't matter. Like, just inject it right into my veins. I need this right now. It's comforting.
Yeah, and that there's nothing wrong with indulging in that comfort every now and again. And also, I should mention, there are like some games and pieces of media where it's not hard to do that. There's sometimes when you go back to it and you load it up and you get the title screen and you're like, I love this. I'm back. I'm young again. Things are so simple. And then you play it for 10 minutes. You're like, this is dog shit. Everything about this is garbage. None of this is fun at all.
Examples
and you know immediately.
From your, like, just for fun, because like I've been ragging on DK64, but I've got a ton
You've
of
been
those,
ragging real hard on DK64,
it's just
man.
my latest example, and I've watched like 1,000 videos of people deconstructing it. So what's your take on some games that happened to you with?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. So I played only exclusively perfect games when I was younger, so it is a little bit hard to remember.
Right.
No, I actually had I had a really interesting time with this in high school, which, you know, it is weird because it's like late high school, early college, which is weird because it's also partially times I am nostalgic for already. But you know, I owned a PlayStation when I was younger, and that was the like PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2 that were the consoles of choice. And one of my really good friends at the time did not own those when he was younger. So at some point I discovered an old box of all my PlayStation 1 games, and, you know, he had not played any of them. So I just kind of systematically went through and we played through those games and kind of engaged in them and said like, oh, hey, like, here's this game I played all the time when I was 9 years old, and did that for a lot of games, right? That was the first introduction that he had ever had to the Gauntlet series of games, which I think is bad. That was the first introduction he ever had to a lot of games that I held very dear to my heart, like RoboCop LAPD and Unholy War for PlayStation 1, both of which were not huge hits, which I think is wrong because they're so good. But also, I recognize that they're not so good, but it's really hard because I have such a strong emotional attachment to those games. And then there were also, there were other games in that mix, like Bushido Blade for PlayStation 1, which is an all-time classic, and everybody who's ever played it says so, even if they didn't play it until the late 2000s. But I do think that was a really good way for me to go through there. Again, games like The Unholy War, which I remember being absolutely amazing, which was, I should set that up because nobody knows what that game is other than me. It was like a kind of top-down isometric fighting game where, you just chose from a bunch of different characters and ran around, and each character had like 2 to 3 moves, and that was about it that you can engage, but it had a tactical layer on top of that, and it was extremely like robots versus native creatures on this island. There was some environmentalism themes that went over my head but also weren't handled well to begin with. Also, I rented that game from my local video store at one point and stepped on it and took just an enormous chunk out of the CD of that game. I'm not talking like you could barely see it. It was like twice the size of my thumb, and that game, literally not a single part of it didn't work perfectly after I took an enormous chunk out of that. We popped it right back in the PlayStation, and it worked perfectly.
That's
because games back then were made right, man. They left whole pieces of the CD untouched.
That's wonderful.
So I don't know. Like, again, a lot of the games that I played when I was younger were a little bit
Perfect.
less. Yeah, they were perfect. But I didn't play the huge marquee one like the Nintendo games. And then games like the Final Fantasy series, which if you listen to our last one, you know that I was a huge aficionado of. I think most of those hold up because I like that style of gameplay and the writing relatively well. So
sure.
Great.
So I wanna kind of move out into a space where I want to talk about if you feel like, because I definitely have had this feeling, have you ever felt like you were too deep into things that made you feel nostalgic? Like, we were talking about the neurological, like, hey, like, you can become sort of addicted to this in a way, of like just feeling good from the things of the past. What sort of experiences or like advice would you give for people who are feeling like that? I'm curious if you have anything.
I mean, I would consider myself wholly unqualified to give advice on
professional, but
how
like
to move past that. I mean, and not even just professional. Just like I would feel unqualified because I haven't struggled with that too much, right? I think it is. I think the closest you come to feelings, or the closest I personally have come to feelings like that, is things like moving to a new place and not knowing people in the area, or not having a job in the area, or interests or whatever, and being nostalgic for where you used to live and like the friend groups that you used to carry and things like that. Yeah. But I think we're also at kind of an interesting time in human history where like that is not as big of an issue as it was before, because the world has gotten so much smaller with the like advancements in communication technologies, so that like most of the people I was friends with when I lived in Denver versus the people I lived in Wisconsin versus the people when I lived in Illinois, like I still talk to them if I was close friends with them, because it's not hard to do anymore. So yeah. I'm not great at parsing that out. I think you do see people who have that issues, right? And I think the best thing to do is always to just try to be honest with yourself and find people who will be honest with you, right? Because when you're talking about people who are addicted to nostalgia and have an issue with it versus people who just enjoy it, you're talking about like a group of high school friends who talk and enjoy the reminiscing about the past versus that person who never moved on from high school being the best time in their life, right? Like there's a huge difference between those two groups, and what you just really need to be honest with yourself. And if you're not, I think the thing that I would come to is if you are not looking forward to the future as potentially being better than the past, you have a problem. Like that comes out very harsh, but like that is where you would potentially start to be like, okay, why do I not feel that way? Separating things like, issues with depression and anxiety that like obviously cloud your judgment relatively, but that's kind of where I would come from with it.
Sure.
What about you? Do you have a better answer for it?
Not really. I mean,
okay. I
was more talking in terms of like games specifically.
No,
which I
yeah, but
framed a little bit better. But I think what you had is really important because my best friend from like when I was like 5 or 6, like sometimes we catch ourselves talking about the past so much, and I'm like, oh my god, are we like, is this sad? You know what I mean? Like, you ever get into those moments where you're like, is this pathetic that we're just recollecting like moments of our past that were funny or just like fun, but we don't really have anything new to say to each other? Like, have you ever run into that?
I have 100% run into issues where I was thinking that before, and it's a bad feeling.
It's really scary. You feel like, oh my god, what happens when we run out of things to mention back and forth to each other? And I try to like distance myself from that a little bit more, but I always want to come back to it. So it's not like a huge massive problem, but it's something interesting to think about. But when it comes to terms of video games, I honestly think this is my number one pet peeve with people is like, I think that people are too afraid to leave their comfort zone of video games. And sometimes I think it is based on the time you spend with certain games and your comfort with them, like, you know, big multiplayer games. Like, you know, one of my friends, that's all they can play. Like, they don't mess with anything else. That's all they do. Or, you know, just like being very reserved about what you enjoy and things like that, or just like I just have, you know, these couple games that I play all the time. Like someone else I'm related to, it does that a lot, where they just like, they play the same, like, you know, RPG over and over again because that's comforting to them. I'm like, in my mind, it's just like, how, that's just crazy to me. I can't imagine feeling so in love with a game that you come back to it, you know, year in and year out. Like, if you're in that space, I'm not saying that, like, you should leave it, but you should think about it more. Because I don't know. It kind of bothers me. And I don't want to, I feel like it's a bad thing to say, like, you're doing this wrong because you should be playing all these new interesting things. And I know it comes off that way, but I guess I want people to consider it and think about it. Like,
I think
maybe try something different out, and you may like it, you may hate it, but at least you tried.
Going off of that specific thing, right? I think the big difference is, I agree that, like, hey, people should try out different types of games, right? People who mostly play multiplayer games should try giving one of these bigger single player games. People who mostly play, like, mechanics heavy games should try giving, like, one of these story based games a try. But I think the biggest thing is it does depend on what you come to games for, right? You know, games are just one form of media. They're just one form of entertainment. They're just one form of, like, emotional connection, right? Sure. So if you play the same RPG over and over and over again, year after year after year, but you're just playing it because you want something to, like, you know, calm you down, or you're playing it because it really helps you just have something like you can mechanically do that, you know, all the way through, and, like, you're not really interested in getting, you know, this type of new experience because this isn't the form of media that you engage with, or this isn't the thing that you are expanding your horizons on. Like, I think that's fine. I think the problem is, like, if you only play one type of game and spend all your time playing games and, like, make your identity based on, like, games, and then you don't expand your horizons, that's where you start to be a problem, right? Like, people don't grow when they're comfortable. That is just, you know, it is a relatively well accepted fact that, like, growth comes from moving yourself outside of your comfort zone. And when it comes to growing your interest in games, when it comes to growing, you know, what you view as, like, effective media, you have to engage with media you would not otherwise see as effective. You know, this is the same thing with people who say that music was only good in the 70s and then, or the 80s or whatever, and now people don't even play instruments. Like, if you believe that, there's a lot of music you should be listening to right now that disproves that very, very, very easily. But, you know, I don't think that's unique to video games, but I do want to stress that, like, you know, video games are also a type of media that some people don't engage with for any reason other than comfort, right? Like, and I think that's fine as long as that's not the only piece of media you're engaging in.
Yeah, I guess I think people underestimate how fast you can feel that same comfort with something different, or how you can trigger nostalgic feelings about something with certain distances of time. And I think that's interesting too, is saying, like, what is the time threshold of feeling nostalgic for something? Because for example, when I listen to the Outer Wilds soundtrack, is that looking back at something fondly nostalgic, or is it appreciating what I went through with that game? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's different types of comfort, because I do feel comforted listening to it because I remember all the great things that happened, and what made me happy about it. And I guess in my mind, it's like, if you feel comfort from all those, you know, those older games, I guarantee you'll find comfort too somewhere else, and it'll be even higher ignited, because there's no way you can consume the same thing over and over again and feel as positive about it as you did the last time. Listen, there's only so many times you can listen to Megalovania, right? Like, it's only got good so many times.
Correct.
But I that's just how I've felt in the past, and I know I'm wrong on this sort of. I think there are people who can feel like that, but I just can't die on that hill. I feel very strongly about that you can find comfort in new things very quickly.
It's so weird because on the one hand, I agree. Like, when we are looking at games, I agree with you, right? I have had this argument with people who really only stick to one type of games. They should really be trying something else because I know for a fact they would enjoy it. But then on the very same token, I will sit down and be like, all right, for the next 3 months, the only thing I'm going to watch on TV is, like, Parks and Rec again, or The Office, or, whatever.
That's true.
Those are random examples that are just very popular right now. But, there's comfort food in terms of, like, TV, where it's like, I know that there is other good stuff out there right now, but I don't want to expend the emotional energy to engage with something new on that level if I am already doing that in another form of media. Right? If I'm already going to sit down and spend 4 hours playing a brand new game for the podcast, I don't then want to sit down and watch a brand new episode of a TV show that's going to be really engaging. I just want to, like, zone out and recharge. But I think, the flip side of that is, like, if 4 years from now the only TV show that I could say I had watched was Parks and Rec, or the only music I had listened to was XYZ, I think that would start to be a problem. I think, it's a weird balance to strike, and I think it is different for everybody in the position that they're in, obviously. But I would encourage you, in any form of media, whether it be music, TV, movies, or especially games, because that's the only one I feel like we can talk, like, with any sort of authority about. Like, if you have something that you're that comforted by, you are right. You will find something else that you can be that comforted by if you continue to explore new things. And also, if you ever think that a form of media was better in the past and it'll never get back to that golden era, you are almost certainly wrong, and you are not engaging with good media currently.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it just comes down to what you said about balancing. It's about whether if it's not games, then it should be shows, or if it's not games and shows, it should be books or movies, or you need to, if you're consuming media, you should be consuming some form of new media. I think I can agree with that. I think I can sit on that and say, if you're just playing the same game over and over again, that's fine. Just, like, try and consume something new, because it's important for people out there creating those new things, and it's important for yourself. So yeah, I think I can die on that hill.
I love that we were talking about nostalgia and talking about every form of media that you could be, and neither one of us for this entire podcast once said the word books. Because we're very fucking smart.
Well, yeah. Listen, I read D&D 5e. I'm really nostalgic for 2e.
No, it's good. It's great. No, I think I agree with that. I also think this is. I feel like we're pretty much wrapping up here, but I do think it's interesting. And as a case study, I don't know what we would do with this, but I do think it's interesting to look at how nostalgia can be played into to create new experiences, specifically looking at Hypnospace Outlaw, a game that we talked about for this podcast and interviewed the developer of, a game that is literally trying to evoke the exact feeling of being on the internet at that time, but a game that also has, like, an interesting story to tell and endearing characters and, like, good writing and good music and stuff built in, so it plays on nostalgia 1,000%. But it's not, like, bad with it. It's not like, hey, here's this thing that you remember. Isn't it cool that you remember it? It's like, hey, here's this, like, recreation of this thing that you remember. And also now here is, like, my version of it for you to engage with that is interesting the whole way through. Like, I think that game specifically does a really good job striking that balance between engaging with your nostalgia and giving you, like, actually interesting narrative and actually, like, interesting media built into it.
Like I was saying earlier, it kind of baited you in a way to say, like, isn't this old internet stuff fun and nostalgic for you? And then when you got in there, it raised a lot of interesting questions about this world that he built, and, like, the positives and negatives of old internet, and, like, what a mega ISP looks like. You know what I mean? Like, it's just very
Yeah.
God,
and on top
really
of that
like
was
that
really
game.
sincere with the characters in there in terms of like, hey, this is what people were like. These aren't real people, but this is what people were like. Like these, you could imagine this being somebody doing this in their free time.
GeoCities, man. God, if you haven't played
good times.
Hypnospace Outlaw, that is a game. If that concept sounds interesting to you, it is 100% worth it.
Yep, go check out Hypnospace Outlaw. Play through the thing. We did a podcast on it where we interviewed the developer of it, so you can check that out too.
Yeah.
But it's worth playing even if you don't check out that episode because it was a super fun game.
Yeah. The only other thing, I think I just have one more thing. Is that okay? Is that allowed?
Yeah,
Am I okay?
I think you're okay.
Okay.
Yeah, you're good. Just this once.
Am I okay?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I wanted to talk about feeling nostalgia for things and what is required to feel nostalgic about it. And what I mean by that is specifically in terms to re-releases or emulation. So, for example, I want to play Super Mario World, right? Some people feel like they couldn't enjoy Super Mario World if it wasn't on a Super Nintendo. Like it has to be on that console or they don't feel good about playing it. It can't be emulated. It can't be on like the Wii or sorry, I always call it the Snap, the Switch. Nintendo's new Snap, and you just fucking snap those controllers off. That's my comedy bit. I'll be here all night.
Hey, that's great. That's great.
Anyways, so whether it's on like a different system or an emulator, they just don't feel right about it unless it's on a specific controller. Do you feel like that at all? Because I've never felt like that. I'm like, as long as the game's there and I can control it, it's not a big deal.
So I've never once in my life felt that way.
Okay.
But I can imagine where you would if, again, it is a very, very mechanics-heavy game, something like Super Mario World, where basically, there's the mechanics that you engage with and everything else is kind of dress setting, right? Like, I think if you played enough of that so that you know intrinsically how it feels, and then you play it on an emulator where there is some degree of latency or there was some degree of, like, something that they had to sacrifice in order to get it to work for the general public, I can imagine that you would have a feeling that it is in some way off, and that would just
if you probably consume
ruin
it so much that like it just like, oh my god, this just feels weird, or like you have a certain muscle memory with the controller. You know what I mean? I think controllers play a really big factor into it more than anything, because I know some people like they're fine to play the emulated version of it, but they have to have a USB version of that controller. So I don't know. I just thought that was really interesting to say, like, sometimes nostalgia has like gates and barriers where it's like you can't trigger that feeling unless you are in a particular space or, have a physical object.
And I think that is really cool. And I mean, cool in terms of like, it's really interesting to think about. But yeah, I wonder how much that is mechanically versus how much that is like how much that would happen in other media, right? Because when you said that and like we were talking about it, my immediate thought was like, okay, I've never felt that way in a game because I've never had like such mechanical fidelity with a game that I would immediately know that something is off.
Yeah.
But like, I remember watching Scrubs when it came out on Netflix for a while, and they didn't get the licensing deal, so they had to change some of the music. And like, I didn't necessarily know when the music was different, but I know when a scene didn't feel the way I remembered it to feel.
Yeah, that's
and I
crazy.
imagine it's got to be that exact same feeling, but instead of just that one scene, it's every time you're touching the game.
They talked about that like on the very first episode of the Scrubs podcast, by the way, where they're like, hey, don't watch it on the streaming services because they don't have all the licensed music, and it's a real fucking bummer, man. Yeah, that's really fascinating. For some reason that didn't trigger for me because I didn't feel nostalgic about Scrubs because of the music, so I never noticed it until they mentioned it. And I watched a lot of Scrubs on the DVD. So.
I wanted to be known. I watched a lot.
I'm
of
a
Scrubs.
Scrubs boy, okay, tip to toe. I wear Scrubs. Okay, I think I'm pretty happy about that. How do you feel?
I feel good. I feel like we covered a lot of ground relatively quickly, and I don't really have much more to say about the word nostalgia.
Do you want to just keep talking about this over and over again every 2 weeks?
I think, yeah, maybe not
I
every
feel
2
so
weeks
warm
because
about
I
it.
think
You feel so
I feel
good.
like I want enough time so that I can really feel like I forgot all the things that were wrong with this podcast, and then we can do it again.
Got it.
And then I'll
So like
just long
next
enough.
year.
Yeah, I think next April we'll do another nostalgia podcast talking about how great April in 2020 was.
Well, we'll just do it in our relation to games.
There we go.
Sort of have a fun send off for us. Do you have a nostalgia greeting card? Is that anything?
I'll work on that. Do you want to tell us all about where people can follow and find us?
Yeah, that's more important, huh?
A little bit.
You can find us on any podcasting apps. We should be there. If we're not, please let us know so we can identify and hunt down those apps, maybe. And our email is thoughtsfromplayer1@gmail.com. We do most of our posting on Twitter at thoughtsfrompl1. That's at thoughtsfrompl1. Our Facebook, we have one. We don't really post there anymore because it doesn't get a lot of love. So if you show it some love, maybe we'll post there. But probably
we should do that more. That's on us. We should do that more.
Yeah. But anyways, so Twitter is our main thing. We also have a Discord server. Don't sweat on the Discord server. We're going to be posting when we get some people running around there. We've already got 2 people there. Don't tell them it's me and you.
I won't, but you probably shouldn't either.
Shit. We have 2 people there. And we're just going to be posting the games we're playing and, just game discussion stuff. And don't sleep on it. It'll be fun. All right.
We do have a subreddit where I'm posting all of the new episodes. Feel free to hop on there and leave any comments, make any posts that you want. I'll pretty much approve anything as long as it's not shitty. And yeah, that's a good place to start discussions about episodes. I think that's everything. So I have a greeting card that is more time-focused than nostalgia-focused, but it kind of feeds in anyway.
Okay. Let's
all
hear
right.
it.
Are you ready?
Let's hear it.
Forget about the past. You can't change it. Forget about the future. You can't predict it. Forget about the present. I didn't buy you one. Happy podcast.
Happy podcast.